The ancient stone stood at the edge of the village like a silent sentinel. Weathered by centuries of wind and rain, its surface covered in symbols so old that no one living could read them anymore. Mara had been coming to this stone every night for 5 years, ever since her grandmother pressed the iron key into her palm with trembling hands and whispered the words that would become both her purpose and her burden. Light the candle when darkness falls. Stay until the flame burns down to nothing. Never miss a night, no matter what calls you away. Her grandmother died 3 days later, and Mara had honored that final request with a devotion that bordered on obsession, dragging herself to the stone through fevers that made her bones ache, through storms that turned the path into rivers of mud, through nights when exhaustion pulled at her like hands trying to drag her down into sleep. The villagers thought she was touched, a little mad perhaps, clinging to superstitions that belonged to a time before electric lights and paved roads. They smiled at her with pity when she passed, this young woman who should have been thinking about marriage and children, but instead spent her nights alone in the dark, beside a rock that meant nothing to anyone but her. But Mara had seen things in those 5 years that kept her faithful to the vigil, shadows that moved wrong in the peripheral darkness, whispers in languages that hurt to hear, the feeling of being watched by something vast and patient, and utterly inhuman. She never told anyone about those moments, because she knew they would think her crazier than they already did. But she felt in her bones that the ritual mattered, that her grandmother had given her this task, for a reason that transcended understanding. Then came the night that changed everything, the night her sister Ellie was brought home bleeding and broken from a car accident on the mountain road. Her face white as paper, her breathing shallow and wrong. The ambulance was already on its way, but the nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and every minute counted. And Mara's mother grabbed her arm with desperate fingers and begged her to come with them, to sit in the back and hold Ellie's hand and keep her awake and talking, because if she fell asleep, the paramedics said she might not wake up. Mara looked at the clock and saw that dusk was falling, felt the familiar pull of obligation like a fishhook in her chest. But when she looked at Ellie's pale face and heard her mother's sobbing pleas, she made a choice she had never made before. She climbed into the ambulance and left the stone unattended, left the candle unlit, broke 5 years of unbroken vigil for the first time since her grandmother's death. The hospital was chaos and fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic that couldn't quite cover the scent of fear, and Mara sat in a plastic chair for 7 hours while surgeons worked to save her sister's life, holding her mother's hand and whispering prayers to gods she wasn't sure she believed in. When the doctor finally emerged with tired eyes and told them that Ellie would live, that she would need months of recovery, but she would live, Mara felt something break loose in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Her mother hugged her and thanked her for being there, for choosing family over that old stone and its meaningless rituals, and Mara tried to feel relief, but all she could think about was the dark path, back to the village, and what might be waiting there. They returned home near dawn, and Mara left her exhausted mother sleeping and walked through the gray pre-dawn light toward the stone, her heart hammering against her ribs with a dread she couldn't name. The path felt different somehow, the air heavier, charged with something that made her skin prickle and her breath come short. When she rounded the final bend and saw the clearing where the stone stood, she stopped so suddenly she nearly fell, because someone was there. A man stood with his back to her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes that looked wrong somehow, archaic, his dark hair falling past his shoulders. He had one hand pressed against the stone's surface, and his head was bowed as if in prayer or mourning, and even from a distance Mara could feel the power radiating from him like heat from a fire. She should have run, should have screamed, should have done anything except what she did, which was take a step forward and speak in a voice that came out steadier than she felt. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" The man went very still, his hand sliding from the stone, and when he turned to face her, Mara felt the world tilt sideways because she knew him. She had never seen him before in her life, but she knew the angles of his face, the storm gray color of his eyes, the way he moved with a warrior's controlled grace. She knew him the way she knew her own heartbeat, with a certainty that bypassed logic and lived somewhere deeper than bone. His eyes widened when he saw her, genuine shock breaking through what had been a mask of careful control. And he took a step toward her before stopping himself, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Mara," he said, and his voice was rough like he hadn't used it in a very long time. "You came back." She shook her head, confusion making her dizzy, because how did this stranger know her name, and why was he looking at her like she had returned? "From the dead. I don't know you," she said, and something that might have been pain flashed across his face before he locked it away behind stone. "My name is Kale," he said, "and I have been waiting for you for 300 years. I was beginning to think you had forgotten me entirely, forgotten us, forgotten everything we were before the curse took it all away." Mara's instinct was to laugh, to dismiss this as the ravings of someone deeply unwell, but there was something in his eyes that stopped her, a weight of sorrow and longing that felt too real to be madness. Before she could respond, he continued, his words coming faster now as if a dam had broken. "You have been keeping vigil at this stone every night for 5 years, lighting a candle and standing guard until dawn, and you think you are protecting the village. But that was never the truth your grandmother told you. The vigil was a prison, Mara, a binding ritual that kept me trapped between worlds, unable to fully cross into death or return to life, suspended in darkness with only your presence to remind me that the mortal world still turned beyond my reach." The words hit her like physical blows, and she stumbled backward, shaking her head in denial, because this couldn't be real, couldn't be possible. But Kale kept talking, relentless now, and she found she couldn't look away from his face. "Your grandmother knew what she was doing when she passed the vigil to you, knew that you carried the bloodline of the first guardian, the woman who bound me here 3 centuries ago, when I failed in my duty and let darkness spill into the world. She was trying to protect you by keeping me imprisoned, because if I ever crossed fully into your world again, the entity that hunts me would follow, and it would destroy everything and everyone you love to get to me. But last night you didn't come. Last night the seal was broken, and I am free whether I want to be or not. And now we have perhaps 3 days before it realizes I have escaped and comes looking." Mara felt her legs give out and she sat down hard on the damp grass, her mind spinning with impossible information, trying to process what he was saying. "This is insane," she whispered, but even as she said it, she was remembering things, flashes of dreams she had been having for years that she always dismissed upon waking. Dreams of a dark-haired warrior, and a love that felt ancient and inevitable and doomed. She looked up at Kale, and saw him watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, seen in ways that terrified her. "If what you're saying is true, if I somehow bound you here, then why do I feel like I know you? Why does looking at you feel like remembering something I've lost?" "Because we have done this before," he said softly, and he moved closer, close enough that she could see the silver scars that covered his hands and forearms, like a map of old violence. "In another life, another time, before the curse and the binding, and all the years of separation, we knew each other well. You were a guardian then too, trained from childhood to stand between the mortal realm and the things that hunger in the dark. And I was a warrior sworn to the same cause, and we fell in love despite knowing it was forbidden, despite understanding that attachments made us vulnerable. When the entity came, when it breached our defenses and began to consume everything we had sworn to protect, we made a choice together, a sacrifice that was supposed to seal it away forever." He paused, pain etching lines around his eyes, and Mara found herself leaning forward, caught in the gravity of his story, despite her rational mind screaming that this was impossible. "But the ritual required a willing vessel," he continued. "Someone to hold the darkness inside themselves and be locked away where it could do no harm. And I volunteered because I thought I could bear it, thought I was strong enough. You tried to stop me, begged me to find another way, but I was arrogant and certain, and I didn't listen. The binding worked, but not the way we planned, because the entity was stronger than we knew, and it twisted the magic, turned the prison into something else. Instead of trapping it, I became its jailer and its prisoner both, locked in a space between life and death, with the darkness eating at me day after day, year after year, century after century. Tears were running down Mara's face now, though she didn't remember starting to cry, because whether she believed him or not, she could feel the truth in his words, could feel the echo of old grief waking up in her chest. "And what happened to me?" she asked. "In that other life, after you were taken." Kyle's face twisted with anguish, and he looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "You blamed yourself," he said hoarsely. "Thought that if you had been stronger or faster or better, you could have found another way. You spent the rest of that life trying to break the curse, studying forbidden magic and making deals with dangerous entities, anything to free me. In the end, you succeeded, but the price was your own life. And with your dying breath, you wove a new binding, a gentler prison that would at least let me feel the passage of time. Let me know that the world continued beyond my cage. That binding has been passed down through your bloodline, grandmother to granddaughter, for 300 years, each woman keeping vigil without knowing the full truth of what they guarded. If you've been enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because your support means everything and helps us bring more stories like this to life. Drop a comment below telling us what you think is going to happen next, because this tale is far from over, and the choices Mara and Kale make now will determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone they love. Mara stood up on shaking legs, her whole world reordered in the space of minutes. Everything she thought she knew about herself and her family and her purpose suddenly revealed as the thinnest surface of a much deeper truth. "So what now?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You said we have 3 days before this entity realizes you're free. What are we supposed to do with 3 days against something that took an army of guardians to barely contain 3 centuries ago?" Kyle met her eyes, and she saw determination there mixed with something that looked like hope, fragile and dangerous. "We do what we should have done the first time," he said. "We fight it together instead of trying to bear the burden alone. And maybe this time we are wise enough to understand that love is not a weakness, but the only strength that matters when facing the dark." The first day after Kyle's return was spent in Mara's grandmother's house, a small cottage at the edge of the village that had belonged to guardian women for generations. The attic was filled with trunks and boxes that Mara had never opened, and together she and Kale sorted through centuries of accumulated knowledge, journals written in fading ink that detailed encounters with supernatural entities, sketches of protective symbols, recipes for wards, and bindings that read like poetry and witchcraft mixed together. Kale moved through the space with growing agitation, pulling out book after book and scanning pages with increasing desperation. "She knew," he muttered. "Your grandmother knew so much more than she ever told you. Look at this." She was tracking the entity's movements, documenting every time it tried to break through the barrier between our prison and the mortal realm. Mara looked over his shoulder at a journal dated just 2 years before her grandmother's death, saw entries that spoke of increased activity, of dreams that felt like invasions, of sensing something vast and hungry pressing against the walls of reality. The last entry was circled in red ink, a single sentence that made Mara's blood run cold. "It knows the bloodline is weakening, and it is patient enough to wait for the breaking point." Her grandmother had known that Mara might one day fail to keep the vigil, had understood that the binding was fraying, but instead of warning her directly, she had simply made sure Mara knew the importance of never missing a night, had tried to protect her through ritual rather than truth. Kale set the journal down gently, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "She should have told you, should have prepared you properly, instead of letting you stumble into this blind." Mara surprised herself by defending her grandmother, by saying what she had come to understand in the hours since Kale's revelation. She was protecting me the only way she knew how, keeping me innocent as long as possible. Because once you know the truth of what we're facing, once you understand the weight of it, you can never unknow it, can never go back to simple happiness. Maybe she thought I would have more years before I had to carry this burden, Or maybe she hoped the entity would weaken enough over time that the next generation wouldn't have to fight at all. They spent the afternoon creating new wards, layering protection over Mara's house and her mother's house, and Ellie's hospital room. Because if the entity came, it would target the people Mara loved to draw her out. Cale worked with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through complex gestures as he murmured words in a language that seemed to reshape the air itself. And Mara tried to learn, tried to absorb 300 years of lost knowledge in a handful of hours. She had always been sensitive to the supernatural, had felt the presence of things unseen, but under Cale's instruction she began to understand that sensitivity could be shaped into power, that her bloodline gave her more than just the duty to stand guard. It gave her the ability to push back. As evening fell, they returned to the stone, and Mara lit the candle with shaking hands, feeling foolish and essential all at once. Cale stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and for a long moment, they simply stood in silence, watching the flame dance and flicker in the growing darkness. "Do you remember any of it?" he asked quietly. "That first life. Us." Mara closed her eyes and tried to reach for memories that might be buried somewhere in her soul, tried to feel past the walls her current life had built. She caught flashes. Nothing coherent, just impressions of laughter and sparring in a sunlit courtyard, of stolen kisses in the shadow of ancient walls, of hands intertwined while facing something terrible, and the overwhelming certainty that she would have done anything, sacrificed anything, to keep him safe. "I remember feelings more than facts," she said finally. "I remember loving someone so completely that losing them felt like losing half my soul. And I remember guilt, crushing guilt, like I failed the one person who mattered most. Is that real? Or am I just responding to your story, filling in blanks with imagination because I want it to be true?" Cale turned to face her, and the expression on his face was naked and vulnerable, all his warrior's control stripped away. "It's real," he said, "and I have carried those same memories through 300 years of darkness, replaying every moment we had together, torturing myself with all the things I should have said or done differently. I know you don't remember me, not fully, not the way I remember you. But I swear on everything sacred that what we had was real, and if we survive what's coming, I will spend whatever time we have left proving it to you." Before Mara could respond, before she could voice the confusion and longing and terror tangled in her chest, the candle flame turned black, not extinguished, but transformed, burning with a darkness that seemed to swallow light instead of creating it. And the temperature dropped so suddenly that their breath misted in the air. Cale swore viciously and pushed Mara behind him, his hands already moving through protective gestures. But it was too late. Something was here. The shadows around the clearing began to move independently of the wind, gathering and coalescing, taking shape. And Mara felt its attention focus on her like a spotlight made of malice and hunger. The entity didn't have a true form, couldn't be captured by human perception in any complete way, but what Mara saw was enough to make her knees weak with primal terror. It was vast, impossibly vast, a writhing mass of darkness shot through with veins of sickly light, and it had too many eyes, too many mouths, too many reaching appendages that existed in more dimensions than 3. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from inside her own skull, a violation that made her want to claw at her ears. "Little guardian," it crooned, "so fragile, so breakable. Did you really think your absence would free him without consequence? Did you believe you could escape the price your ancestor promised?" Cale planted himself between Mara and the entity, power crackling around his hands in silver-white arcs that hurt to look at directly. "You cannot have her," he said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries, of absolute conviction. "I will not fail her again. I will not let you take her the way you've taken everything else." The entity laughed, a sound like glass breaking and children crying, and more of it poured into the clearing, testing the boundaries of the wards they had laid earlier in the day. "Oh, warrior," it said mockingly, "still so brave, still so willing to sacrifice. But you misunderstand the situation entirely. I do not want her life. I want what she carries. The last spark of the original binding. The key that will finally let me tear open the walls between worlds and spread into realms that have been denied to me for far too long. Mara felt something stir inside her at those words, felt a presence she had never noticed before suddenly make itself known, an ancient power coiled around her heart like a sleeping serpent. The entity surged forward, testing their defenses, and Kale unleashed everything he had. Centuries of accumulated power and rage focused into a strike that should have obliterated anything mortal. The entity screamed and recoiled, actually hurt. And in that moment of reprieve, Kyle grabbed Mara's hand and ran. They sprinted through the forest with impossible speed, Kyle pulling her along with supernatural strength, and behind them she could hear the entity tearing through the trees in pursuit, reality warping and cracking under the weight of its presence. They burst into her grandmother's house, and Kale slammed the door, reinforcing it with every protection he could summon while Mara collapsed against the wall, her lungs burning, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she had just witnessed. "That's what you've been holding back for 300 years, she gasped. "That's what I've been feeding power to, with my vigil without even knowing it. Oh God, Kale. How did you survive being trapped with that thing?" His face was gray with exhaustion as he worked, sweat running down his temples. And when he finally finished layering the protections, he turned to her with eyes that held depths of suffering she couldn't fathom. "I survived because I had to," he said simply. "Because I knew you were out there somewhere, living and breathing and carrying on. And as long as you existed, I could endure anything." They made it through that first night, but both knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The entity now fully aware that Kale had escaped and actively hunting them, testing their defenses, learning their patterns. The second day was spent in frantic preparation, Mara calling in every favor she could think of, contacting distant relatives her grandmother had mentioned in letters, people who carried diluted versions of the guardian bloodline and might be able to help. Most thought she was insane, but a few, the ones who had grown up hearing the same stories and warnings, agreed to come, to stand with her when the entity made its final push. Kyle trained her ruthlessly, pushing her past the point of exhaustion, and then further still, because there was no time for gentle instruction, and no margin for error. He taught her how to channel the power in her blood, how to shape her will into weapons that could harm things that existed outside normal reality. She learned that pain could be transmuted into power, that fear could be forged into focus, that the love she felt for her family and her village, and even for this strange warrior who claimed to have loved her across lifetimes, could become an unbreakable shield. By the end of the second day, she could create wards that held against Kale's full strength, could sense the entity's probing attacks before they landed, could fight beside him with a synchronicity that felt like muscle memory. That night, they returned to the stone together, and this time when Mara lit the candle, she poured her power into it, transformed it from a simple flame into a beacon that burned with pure guardian magic. The entity came at midnight, heralded by a silence so complete that even the insects stopped singing, and this time it didn't bother with subtlety. It crashed against their defenses like a tsunami, overwhelming and relentless. And Mara felt the wards beginning to crack under the pressure. The relatives she had called arrived then. 6 women, ranging from teenagers to grandmothers, each carrying a fragment of the guardian bloodline, and together they formed a circle around the stone and linked their power. What followed was a battle that existed as much in the spiritual realm as the physical. A clash of wills and magic that bent reality until Mara couldn't tell where she ended, and the others began. She felt Kale fighting beside her, felt the steady certainty of his presence like an anchor in the storm, and she understood in that moment why their love had been forbidden, because together they were so much more than the sum of their parts, their powers amplifying and resonating until they burned like a star. The entity screamed and raged, trying every tactic it knew, offering bargains and threats and promises, anything to break their unity. It showed Mara visions of possible futures, timelines where she walked away and let others deal with the burden, where she chose her own happiness over responsibility and got to live a bay, Normal life with a normal family and normal joys. It showed her Kale's suffering across 3 centuries. Every moment of anguish and despair, trying to make her hate him for not being strong enough to escape sooner, for letting her waste 5 years on a vigil that was his prison. It showed her everyone she loved dying, her mother, her sister, her village consumed by darkness, while she stood helpless and broken. But Mara had spent 5 years standing guard in the darkness, 5 years learning to face fear without flinching. And she did not break. Instead, she reached for the thing coiled around her heart, the piece of the original binding her ancestor had placed there 3 centuries ago, the key the entity wanted so desperately. She pulled it free, felt it unfold in her hands like a flower made of light and razor wire, and she understood finally what she had to do. The binding hadn't failed because it was weak. It had failed because it tried to separate the light from the darkness, tried to lock away evil instead of transforming it. And that was a battle no one could win forever. Mara looked at Kale across the circle and saw him realize what she intended, saw horror dawn on his face as he shouted no, reaching for her. But she was already moving. She took the binding, took the key, took every scrap of power she had learned to wield, and she opened herself up completely, invited the entity in instead of pushing it away. It rushed into her like a flood, darkness and hunger and malice. But it met something it hadn't expected. It met love, the kind of love that had survived death and centuries and impossible odds, the kind of love that saw the broken pieces of something and chose to heal instead of destroy. Mara felt Kale's power join with hers, felt him refuse to let her face this alone, and together they did what no single guardian could have done. They took the entity's hunger and fed it truth instead of fear, showed it beauty and connection and all the reasons existence was worth preserving. They took its rage and met it with compassion, acknowledged the pain that had twisted it into something monstrous. They didn't destroy it because destruction would have only fed the cycle. Instead, they transformed it, broke it down into component pieces and wove it back into the fabric of reality where it belonged, darkness that gave definition to light instead of consuming it. When Mara came back to herself, she was lying on the ground with Kale's arms around her, both of them covered in silver burns from channeling more power than mortal bodies were meant to hold. The other guardians were scattered around the clearing, exhausted but alive, and the stone was glowing softly, its ancient symbols visible for the first time in centuries. The entity was gone, truly gone, not imprisoned or bound, but transformed into something that could exist without causing harm. Kale was crying silently, his face buried in her hair, and she realized he was repeating the same, words over and over like a prayer. I thought I lost you again. I thought you were going to sacrifice yourself and leave me alone for another 300 years. Please don't ever do that to me again. Mara turned in his arms and kissed him, tasted salt from his tears and felt the rightness of it down to her bones, remembered suddenly and completely what it had been to love him before, in that first life, with the certainty of youth and the recklessness of warriors who thought they were invincible. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered against his mouth. We did it. We broke the cycle. We're finally free. The other guardians departed as dawn broke, returning to their own lives with promises to stay in touch, to rebuild the network that had been fractured by centuries of secrecy. Mara's mother called to say Ellie was being discharged from the hospital, was asking for her sister. And Mara realized with a start that only 3 days had passed, that the entire world had changed. But her family knew nothing of it. The weeks that followed were strange, adjusting to a reality where Mara wasn't bound by nightly vigil, where she could make choices based on what she wanted instead of what duty demanded. Kale stayed close, learning how to exist in a modern world that bore little resemblance to the one he remembered, and slowly, carefully, they built something together that felt like healing. He helped her repair the cottage, spent hours listening to her talk about her life and her dreams, shared stories from his own past that made her laugh and cry and understand him better. They visited Ellie in the hospital, and Mara watched Kale be gentle with her sister, saw him charm her mother without trying, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't known was restless. Her family accepted him with surprising ease, maybe sensing that he made Mara happy in ways she had never been before, or maybe just relieved that she finally had someone to share the burden of her strange responsibilities. When Ellie asked how they met, Mara glanced at Cale and saw mischief in his eyes. "We've known each other forever," he said with perfect honesty. "We just had to find each other again." 6 months after the battle at the stone, Mara stood in the clearing at sunset, no longer keeping vigil, but visiting a place that had become sacred for different reasons. Kyle appeared through the trees carrying wildflowers he had picked from the forest, and she smiled at the sight of him, at the way he had learned to move through the world with less wariness, letting down guards that had been up for centuries. He presented the flowers with mock formality, and she laughed, pulled him down to sit beside her in the grass. "Tell me something you remember about us," she said. "From before. Something I don't know yet." Cale was quiet for a moment. His fingers tangled with hers, and when he spoke his voice was soft with memory. "There was a tradition among the Guardians," he said, "that when two warriors chose to bond themselves to each other, they would plant a tree together, something that would outlive them and mark their commitment. We planted an oak on the day we decided we were going to find a way to be together despite the rules, made promises under its branches that we thought would last forever." Mara felt tears prick her eyes, and she looked at the ancient stone, saw new growth sprouting around its base, life reclaiming what had been a place of imprisonment. "Let's plant another one," she said, "not to replace what was lost, but to honor it, to mark a new beginning." They did, working together in comfortable silence, and when the sapling was settled in the earth, Cale pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made her feel treasured and seen and completely safe. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for 300 years, and I will love you for however many more we get, and I am grateful for every single moment we have together." Mara rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady, and thought about destiny and choice and the strange paths that brought people together. She had spent 5 years standing guard without knowing what she was protecting or why, had made a choice to abandon that vigil for family, and inadvertently set in motion events that changed everything, had discovered powers and purposes she never knew she possessed. She thought about her grandmother and all the guardian women who had come before, thought about the weight they carried and the secrets they kept, and she understood finally that every one of them had been trying to protect the people they loved in the best way they knew. As night fell over the clearing, Mara and Cale remained by their newly planted tree, wrapped in each other's arms, no longer running from darkness or imprisoned by duty, but simply choosing each other, day after day, in a world that was finally at peace. The ancient stone stood silent witness, its purpose transformed, and if you looked closely at its weathered surface, you might see the symbols glowing faintly, not with binding magic, but with blessing. A recognition that some love stories are strong enough to break curses and remake reality, and those stories deserve to be remembered and celebrated and continued across all the years that follow. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more supernatural romance stories that explore the depths of love across time and impossible odds. Leave a comment telling us what resonated most with you, or share your own beliefs about soulmates and destiny, because your engagement helps us create more content like this. Thank you for journeying with Mara and Cale through darkness into light, and remember that sometimes the greatest magic is choosing love, even when it costs everything.